Welcome to the world of photography. Once you enter this world, you look at the world with a different view and discover its beauty. I would like to introduce you to photography so that you too can enjoy this wonderful hobby, or maybe you want to specialize and make photography your profession one day. Capture unforgettable moments and tell a story with your photos once you master the basic techniques. With this video, you can immediately get started with your camera. I explain everything about lenses, cameras and much more. We start at the beginning. You need a camera to take pictures. That of course comes as no surprise. You cannot change the lens with your smartphone or a pocket camera. In this video we talk about cameras where we can change the lenses. But what's the point of interchangeable lenses? Why is one lens not enough? Well, one photographer often shoots macro, so up close, while the other photographer shoots wildlife from far away. So there is a specialized lens for every purpose. I'll tell you more about the lenses later in this video. First, we take a closer look at the camera. You have the camera body that contains a sensor that records your photo. After you have taken the photo, the camera ensures that the image recorded on the sensor is written to the memory card as quickly as possible. Always opt for the highest possible quality of your image settings. You can choose in which file format the camera writes the photo to the memory card, RAW or JPEG or both. RAW is actually the source material of the photo that you can later edit very well via software. JPEG is a ready-made photo that you can immediately post on social media, for example. But JPEG has a disadvantage that afterwards you have fewer options for post-editing on the computer. My advice is shoot in JPEG plus RAW in the beginning. Okay, now let's take a picture. First we mount a lens on the camera body. You first remove the body cap, then you align the Y dot of the lens and the body and place the lens in the body. You turn the lens until you feel and hear a click. Each lens has a minimum focus distance. So if you want to get closer with your camera, your photo will not be sharp. You can see the minimum focus distance on the lens. Set the control dial or preference mode to P mode so that the camera controls the exposure for you. Always make sure to hold the camera firmly to avoid blurry photos. You look through the viewfinder to make a nice composition. When you are ready to take the picture, press the shutter button halfway. At this point the camera will focus and meter the exposure. Then press the button gently until you hear that the picture has been taken. Do not press the button too hard, otherwise you risk a blurred photo or your composition will no longer be correct. Your captured photo will appear on the screen of your camera for a few seconds. The photo is now on the memory card in your camera. If you want to see the photo again, press the play button. Press again and you can take pictures again. Now that we've seen how to take a photo, let's take a look at how the exposure works correctly. There are three elements in exposure. You have aperture, shutter speed and ISO. These three elements cannot do without each other to take a beautiful photo. I sometimes call them the Holy Trinity. This may all be a bit overwhelming for you, but here comes the good news. The camera can calculate that for you. You just set your mode dial to P mode for program and you can take pictures without any problems. All values for aperture, shutter speed and ISO are calculated for you by the camera. By the way, your light meter looks something like this. When the indicator is in the middle, the photo is correctly exposed according to the camera. If the indicator moves to the left, the photo is underexposed according to the camera, so too dark. If the indicator moves to the right, the photo is overexposed according to the camera. But because you probably want to learn more about aperture, shutter speed and ISO, let me explain these three important elements for you. First we have aperture. Your camera sensor needs light to convert the image into a photo. Aperture refers to the lens opening through which light falls on the sensor. The size of this opening determines how much light enters the sensor. In addition, aperture is an important factor in determining the depth of field. The depth of field is the area that will appear sharp in the photo. If you have a high aperture number like f16, a large part of the photo will be in focus. A shallow depth of field means that a small part of the photo is in focus and a large part is out of focus. This can be achieved with a low aperture number such as f1.8. This allows you to be very creative when taking a photo, for example by only having a part in focus. This way you can isolate your subject from the environment and you get a three-dimensional image. You can best compare the lens opening with the pupil of your eye. On a sunny day outside, your pupil is small. When it gets dark outside, your pupil's delayed so you can still see well. Just like with an eye pupil, a large lens opening allows more light to enter in dark situations. This is an overview of the different f-stops, because that's what the different steps are called between the apertures. Each stop is further subdivided into 1/3 intermediate stops. If your lens indicates a maximum of f1.4, that means that a lot of light can enter. With this value you have a limited depth of field. If you turn the aperture all the way to f16, very little light comes through the lens. With this value you have a large depth of field. Summarized, a small number means small depth of field. A large number means a large depth of field. Here you can see the difference in depth of field using an example. With a large aperture value such as f16, you have more in focus. With a small aperture value such as f1.4, you only have a limited part in focus. As you can see, you can get creative with the knowledge you now have about aperture. So if you want to photograph with an aperture preference, set the mode dial to A. The camera then adjusts the shutter speed and ISO value itself to guarantee a good exposure of the photo. Second in line we have shutter speed. The sensor in your camera is closed off by the so-called shutter. If it wasn't there, you would constantly expose the sensor and it would be impossible to take a picture. So you need a certain time in which you expose the sensor. This time is often very short and lasts only a fraction of a second. Otherwise you would have a blurred photo due to your own movement or the movement of your subject. From one shutter speed to the next shutter speed is called one stop. Be sure to remember the word stop because you will hear and use this very often. One stop means that you need twice as much light to have the same correct exposure. Here too, each stop is subdivided into 1/3 intermediate stops. But what shutter speed should I choose? If you want to prevent motion blur, the rule is that you use at least the length of your lens in the shutter speed. 60mm lens, choose 1/60th of a second or faster to avoid motion blur. So if you have a long telephoto lens of 500mm, You have to work with at least 1/500th of a second or faster. You can deviate from this rule by using slower shutter speeds, but then you must use your camera on a tripod. You can also be creative with shutter speeds, just like with Aperture. This photo was taken with a fast shutter speed and freezes the moment. It seems as if the car is stationary. The following photo was taken with a slower shutter speed so that the sensor is exposed for longer. Because the camera follows the movement of the car is sharp and the background blurred. But that's exactly how you create the illusion of movement. A well-known example of using a slower shutter speed is when photographing a waterfall. The slow shutter speed makes it look like the water in the photo is really moving. Sometimes you just want to freeze the moment, like this photo of a surfer. So if you want to photograph with a shutter speed preference, set the mode dial to S. The camera then adjusts the aperture and ISO value itself to have a good exposure of the photo. Third and last in line, we have ISO sensitivity. ISO values are the values that determine the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera. The sensor always needs sufficient light to form an image of what you are taking a picture of. If it is darker outside or inside, the sensor often has insufficient light to form a good and clear image. By increasing the ISO value, the sensor becomes more sensitive to light and then captures more light. Your camera controls the ISO value itself if you choose Auto ISO. Here you see an example of different ISO values. On the left you see ISO 100. This is usually the lowest value in many cameras. On the right you see ISO 25600. This is a very high value. Moving from one ISO value to another is called one stop. Each stop is further subdivided into 1/3 intermediate stops, as with aperture and shutter speed. By increasing the ISO sensitivity, unfortunately more noise also appears. You can see this clearly in this example. The photo on the left was taken at ISO 100 and the photo on the right at ISO 6400. In addition to the increase in extra noise in the photo on the right, you can also see the reduced contrast as a result of the high ISO value. Now that you know what aperture, shutter speed and ISO mean, let's take a look at how exposure works in practice. Here I have a simple picture of a bird. The photo is correctly exposed, not too dark and not too light. These were the settings of the photo. An aperture of 5.6, a shutter speed of 1/500 and ISO value of 800. Suppose I wanted to shoot with an aperture of 2.8 to have less depth of field so that the background would become even more blurred. You then shoot in A mode to adjust your aperture. At that moment you get 2 stops too much light. Your camera will automatically compensate for the excess light by accelerating the exposure time, so you get a perfectly exposed photo again. Another example. Let's say I want a faster shutter speed than the camera says because it's a very fast bird that I want to photograph. You then shoot in S mode to adjust your shutter speed. I change my shutter speed from 1/500 to 1/1000th of a second. At that point your photo is 1 stop underexposed, so too dark. Automatically your camera will compensate for the lack of light by opening the aperture 1 stop more so that more light comes in. So you get a perfectly exposed photo again. One last example for the ISO value. Let's say I want a lower ISO that the camera suggests to reduce noise. Because you have seen the higher the ISO value, the more noise can be seen in the photo. It's best to photograph in M mode to adjust your aperture and shutter speed. You switch off the auto ISO and then determine the ISO value manually. I'm lowering my ISO value from 800 to ISO 200. At that moment your photo is 2 stops underexposed. You will then have to open your aperture by 2 stops more to compensate for the shortage of light. So you get a perfectly exposed photo again. As you can see, aperture, shutter speed and ISO cannot do without each other. It might be a bit overwhelming at first to take all this into account, but the more you practice this, the easier it becomes. Autofocus stands for Automatic Focus, or AF. It's the system with which your camera automatically focuses on a subject. Autofocus is an easy way to get your image sharp quickly. Most cameras today are very precise and fast at this. This way you can be sure that your photo will be sharp. You also use autofocus if you want to determine which part of the photo should be in focus. It's possible to manually shift the focus point. On most cameras you can choose from different autofocus modes. AFS for Nikon, one shot for Canon. This is the mode where the focus is on one specific spot. This is called single shot AF. APS-C, AI servo for Canon. In this mode the camera focuses on one subject. Even if the subject moves, the camera will continue to focus on it. This is called continuous AF. AFA. In this mode the camera chooses single shot or continuous AF based on the situation. Autofocus is not a holy grail. The autofocus system does not work equally well in every situation. For example, if there is a little contrast between the subject and the background, the camera will have trouble focusing. Even if you are very close to your subject, the camera will not be able to get the right part in focus. In such cases, use the manual focus option. You then focus manually via the lens ring. The white balance determines the color temperature of the photo and is expressed in Kelvin. Correct white balance ensures that the colors in the photo look just like they do in real life. A different white balance makes the photo more yellow or bluer. But how do you set the white balance? You can choose to leave the white balance on automatic mode, then the camera will determine which settings are best for that moment. You can also set the white balance manually. Do not forget to change the settings again if you go outside from inside, for example. Otherwise you will still end up with a photo with the wrong colors. If you shoot in RAW and not in JPEG, it makes little difference at the time of shooting which white balance you choose, because you can still set the white balance yourself in post-processing. That's why it is certainly important to shoot in RAW. Most cameras have the option to shoot in RAW or JPEG, or often both, at the same time. By default, your camera will be set to JPEG. This is therefore the most common type of file and it is used for many digital purposes. Whether that is sending a photo via email or posting a photo on social media. RAW, on the other hand, is not suitable for sharing. In that sense, you could compare it with the old-fashioned film negative that first had to be developed. You didn't show it to your friends either. You must first convert a RAW file to JPEG. This conversion reveals the major advantages of RAW. You can convert your RAW photo to JPEG via software such as Capture One Pro or Adobe Lightroom. For example, you can easily change the white balance afterwards via the software. I can best show you the advantages of shooting in RAW by means of an example. In this photo you can see that I measured the light on the houses. In large parts of the clouds, no details can be seen anymore. You can no longer restore these overexposed parts of the clouds in the JPEG photo via software, simply because there is no more data in the lightest parts. The photo only contains the white pixels in the place of the clouds. The RAW photo, on the other hand, does contain this data. Therefore, when editing the RAW file, I was able to beautifully restore the overexposed clouds in the photo. The small nuances in the clouds are now clearly visible. No camera without a lens, of course. Lenses come in different lengths. The length of the lens is expressed in millimeters and is called the focal length. This is always stated on the lens. The focal length is a length between the camera sensor and the optical center of the lens. In this example, I took an 85mm lens. Here you can clearly see how the focal length is determined. But which types of lenses are there and which one should you choose? It really comes down to this. A 50mm lens has about the same viewing angle as what a human eye sees. So you are talking about a 50mm standard lens. Here you can see what different focal lengths represent in a real-world scenario. My first lens is a 24mm lens. This is a wide-angle lens that allows you to capture a lot of the environment in the photo. This 24mm is often used for landscape photography. Next I have a 50mm lens, the so-called standard lens. You have about the same viewing angle as what the human eye sees, as I mentioned earlier. In this photo I used the 180mm lens. As you can see, the angle of view becomes smaller with this telephoto lens and you get to see less of the environment here too. Finally, I put the 300mm on the camera. This is a real telephoto lens that is ideal for bringing everything that is far away, supposedly closer in the photo. A 300mm is ideal for photographing animals from some distance. Here you see the 4 different results side by side. Always the same subject and yet a different picture every time. Do you plan on photographing people often? An 85mm lens is often chosen for portraits. This focal length is believed to be the best because it produces little distortion and flatters the head. I have to add a small nuance to the subject focal length. These values apply to a full-frame camera. If you have a crop sensor or APS-C camera, you need to multiply the focal length by 1.5 in the case of Nikon and Sony. Canon users multiply by 1.6. It seems complicated, but it is quite simple. So if you want a standard 50mm lens on a crop sensor camera, choose a 35mm lens, because 35mm multiplied by the crop factor of 1.5 makes a value of 52.5mm. This crop factor can be useful when shooting wildlife. Your 300mm lens will get an equivalent image of a 450mm lens due to the crop factor. That saves a lot in weight and you get more range. So make sure to check whether you have a full frame or sensor APS-C camera when choosing a new lens. In addition to lenses with a fixed focal length, you also have zoom lenses. An example of this is a popular 70 to 300mm. You can replace multiple lenses with one lens. Zoom lenses can be useful, but a lens with a fixed focal length offers more optical qualities. A prime lens, because that's what you call these lenses with a fixed focal length, are built to shine at one certain length, whereas a zoom lens is often a compromise in quality. Prime lenses can also be used more often in darker conditions, because they usually have an aperture of 1.8 or even 1.4. Zoom lenses often start at aperture 2.8 or even slower. Here you can clearly see the difference between a prime and a zoom lens. Both lenses are set to their maximum aperture. The 35 prime lens at f1.8 gets much more light than the variable aperture zoom lens at 4.2. Photography is a very fun hobby, but because good tools can cost quite a bit of money, you should definitely be careful with what you spend on this hobby. My tip here is to definitely look at second-hand equipment. Many photographers take very good care of their gear, so you can buy beautiful tools for a lot less than the new price. Also, my second tip is shoot often and a lot. This way you will become familiar with your camera and develop your own style in photography much faster. Try to avoid extended periods of non-photography. As with anything, it also applies to photography. Practice makes perfect. Anyway, keep it fun. Don't constantly look at other photographers who may be further along in their career than you are. They too once had to learn the basics of aperture, shutter speed and ISO. You may be able to get inspiration from photographers, but in the end you have to develop your own style. What helped me a lot when I started photography was to only shoot in black and white. At school we were not allowed to photograph in color the first year. That way you have a lot more eye for composition and the use of light in your photo. You don't have to worry about the color aspect yet. The great thing about photography is that you can learn at your own pace. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'll try to answer every question as best as I can. That's it for this video. I hope my explanation was helpful, and be sure to re-watch this video to train the basics of photography. As always, I look forward to see you in the next one. Bye.